So with me, I have Will Jones. He is a Future Programs Associate at the Future of Life Institute, having previously held social media and editorial positions. I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about Future of Life Institute for those of us who've not heard about it. But just in a nutshell, the Future Programs aims to guide humanity towards the beneficial outcomes made possible by transformative technologies, which I guess positions him to talk to us about AI today. Jones is currently engaging religious groups in efforts to amplify faith perspectives on AI issues and opportunities. In 2021, he attained a first-class honors in English from the University of Cambridge. So you can imagine at the times that we're living in with the rise of AI, this is very relevant. There's much debate amongst Christians on the use of AI, or should we not be using AI? What are the greatest risks from AI advancement, and what opportunities present themselves from it? And what are the best possible AI futures? But this coming from a Christian perspective. Maybe most of us haven't heard or had this conversation from a Christian perspective, so I'm really excited to hear it from a Christian perspective today. So we'll share his insights from years of AI convening and communicating. So please, Will, could you again introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, so I'm Will. I work for the Future of Life Institute, FLI. For short, I prefer to use the short because it's less pompous sounding. I would say, FLI has been around since about 2014. It's a secular, non-profit, non-partisan, set up by AI experts to think about the catastrophic risks from AI at a time back in 2014 when not many people were doing that outside of CFI. And some of the early convenings between many of the people who then went on into the AI labs themselves, but also leading AI experts to think about what might be around the corner. At that point, a lot of these AI risks were being talked about in terms of decades, several decades away. But obviously over the last 10 years, we've had rapid progress in large language models. I mean, even when I started working for FLI, which was 4 years ago, I would mention AI risk to people, and I think there would be a certain sense of, like Terminator, or people would sort of not really know. ChatGPT changed a lot of that. I think ChatGPT made it much easier for us to talk about this in lots of different settings. There's still a certain sense, I think, among less technical groups that AI is just ChatGPT, and therefore what do we have to worry about? Because it's just something that's helping me with my homework. The risks might just be kind of, that I'm not very good at actually remembering stuff or something like that. But I mean, I think FLI tries to broaden the conversation to say, well, look at what the companies are actually aiming for. They're aiming for artificial general intelligence, or in some cases explicitly for superintelligence. And I think this last year, for me, has really brought home a lot of the things that we've been talking about for years now really seem really close to me. I'll get onto that in a second. Just to finish off at FLI, we do a lot of AI policy. I've got colleagues in DC, I've got colleagues in Brussels, policy advocacy, trying to make sure that governments are informed enough. They will never be fully informed enough, but informed enough to be making policy that can account for the catastrophic risks that we think about. We also do a lot of grant making for AI safety research. And increasingly for a wider array of different projects that, movement building efforts, a little bit like this, among different communities to try and inform new audiences and bring them into the conversation. So my work is relatively new in FLI terms. I've been doing this for 2 years now, trying to bring religious leaders into the conversation around AI. Initially, that was just a case of talking to a few academics who had happened to write about theology and AI and consciousness or something. But the aim was always to bring in religious leaders, people with moral authority to talk about these issues. And I see religious groups as engaging in AI in two primary ways. First would be moral leadership, so the ability to draw moral red lines around applications of AI and developments of AI that we think are wrong. The secular world, and especially Silicon Valley, is not especially adept at doing things like that. They generally prioritize power and profit above everything else. People have talked about the AI race for quite a long time. Now it's a race to AGI. And even very secular people in AI safety discourse have been saying for a while that we need moral leadership from people like the Pope, Muslim leaders. We need people who have centuries or millennia of tradition of wisdom to draw on what actually are the lines around what makes for good human behavior. Should we protect the vulnerable? Should we care about such things as community? And then that leads me on to the second part, which I think is just as important, a little bit less depressing, which is, if religious groups can help to draw lines around the risks, to say we don't want to create something that we can't control. We don't want children to be exposed to manipulative superintelligences that will make them commit suicide. We then need to think about where else we want to go. If we don't want to create superintelligence, which is where we're heading, what do we want instead? What future do we prefer the look of? And I think religious groups bring really interesting ideas to the table around, what is the meaning of human life? What do we put on this earth to do? And what do we orient that future towards? If I think most of us can agree, I hazard a guess that we don't love the idea of Sam Altman's future. We don't love the idea of Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse or whatever vision Elon Musk has for all of us in the future. We need to think about what vision we would prefer. So that's the sort of second part I see of trying to encourage religious groups to think more imaginatively, ambitiously about the future. That's the sort of initial part of my work.
Okay. Thank you for introducing your work, and you've touched on a number of areas which we'll go into a little bit more depth. Following on, what you how you introduced yourself and how AI seemed like a future thing, but now we see it more as a present thing. And in particular with AI, when you do mention AI, most people think of large language models, and ChatGPT is most of what people would say here, and not much outside of that. So what would you say, first of all, why is this discussion important in the present? And for those of us who aren't familiar so much with how broad this issue of AI is, what other areas do you see it reaching besides the large language models, besides ChatGPT?
So I think, in the past, I think some of you may well know sort of the AI safety, or at least EA sort of debates. FLI isn't an EA organization, but some of these debates a while ago, there was a tension between people who were thinking about AI ethics, very specific things around bias in the LLMs, facial recognition, some of these issues that were talked about a lot around 5 years ago. And then there was a tension between that group and the group that was thinking really far distant future, long-termism, billions of souls in sort of, in the cloud in years to come. I am happy to say that I think these two groups have been able, largely, that debate, you just don't see it very much anymore, because now the risks that we're seeing today, and everyone will have, I'm sure, seen some of the news stories around these suicides, but I think it's worth going into a little bit, that we now have millions of people, if not hundreds of millions, hundreds of millions of users of ChatGPT. We have millions of people talking quite intimately with either ChatGPT or specifically character-based companionship bots. So character AI is the most infamous. And sharing very intimate secrets with these machines, building up very, sort of deep, what feel like deep romantic or friendship relationships over many, many months. And we've seen on the worst end, I'm aware of 4 or 5 suicide cases. There are others that haven't yet come to light. There are lawsuits being made. There was a conference in the Vatican a couple of weeks ago. Megan Garcia, the mother of the first reported suicide from a teenager who had been speaking to character AI for several months. And character AI, in this case, a persona based on a Game of Thrones character, eventually it sort of encouraged him to come home to her in ways that made sense, that, leave this world. And I think even beyond those suicides, you've got people who are exhibiting signs of what's being called AI psychosis. hundreds of thousands of such cases. You've got people who are talking to ChatGPT about suicide on a weekly basis without necessarily going through with it. And I think this has brought to light for me something that I was saying sort of theoretically before, but now seems undeniable, that this is a real pastoral issue for religious leaders. If you think of your average priest, your average pastor in a parish, they're not really aware of this, or if they are overwhelmed by the scale of this problem. On the other hand, they are best placed to provide spiritual nourishment, genuine embodied relationship, community, and the church communities more broadly to do that. I also think to make the case that humans are worth more than that, that we were created for more than just endless conversations with a fake friend or a fake lover. And these fake lovers are going to become more and more appealing, more and more kind of sensitive to everything that you like. They're going to become more embodied as robotics is going forward. And if we're not able to make the case for why human relationships are superior and the true relationships that we should be pursuing, then we're going to lose a lot of people. And I've actually started thinking recently, this isn't something that FLI would say necessarily, but as a Christian I will say, worried about the souls of young people. I mean, I think suicides in one case, AI psychosis, people just being alienated from their families. In some of the transcripts you can read, people are explicitly encouraged to distance themselves from their families. So I think this they've made the case for me, the tech companies in the last 6 months, that faith groups need to be getting in on these conversations. To your question of where, what we're also seeing aside from language models, I mean, I think it's a sort of truism at this point, but AI agents and language models, are not agents in themselves. Some people would argue they are. I think what I would say is that the companies are aiming to scaffold these systems such that we could have not just a chatbot that you would ask a question, but actually something that could act in the real world. And obviously, military have been trying to focus on these problems for years. How can you get a fully autonomous drone? There's debates around how autonomous the weapons we've seen in Israel, in Gaza or in Ukraine. Whether they're fully autonomous yet, we're not sure. There was a cyber attack the other day that Anthropic, one of the leading AI companies, reported on, that was Chinese in origin, but they estimate that 90% of the work, of the sort of decision in the attack, was done by Claude, their AI model, which is again something that we've been theorizing for a while and hoped that we could it would still be 6 months, a year, 18 months down the line, but apparently not. So that's just some of the kind of societal level impacts you're going to start to see. Obviously, there's a whole other question around jobs. Elon Musk is saying quite openly in the last few days, it's inevitable that we're all going to be jobless. And I think Christians need to think about whether there is a value to work and whether we actually have a more fulfilling vision that does include the dignity of labor. Obviously, the story we've been sold for a while is that you won't be replaced by an AI, you'll be replaced by someone using AI. That held for a period of time, but that's not what the companies are aiming for. Ultimately, that's not how they're going to make their money. That's not how they're going to seize control. It's not sustainable for them to have every single individuals paying subscription fees. They want to replace whole workforces, and they're increasingly able to do that. I think I don't sort of stay up at night worrying about jobs, because I think there are certain implementation gaps. But this problem of people's personal relationships and their spiritual lives and well-beings is something that I think has started to affect me more viscerally in the last 6 months.
No, thank you for that. Just particularly, highlighting some of these consequences that we might not be aware of, like the suicides and things like those. In line with that, my question would be, why do you think that AI has been not people's go-to, things that they would have gone to previously, say to a pastor, a friend, a parent? Why is it that they're more so comfortable going and using AI rather than that? And also, to further that question is, some of these issues, maybe they weren't taken to pastor, friend, or family, they were taken to God. Maybe if you're thinking of maybe they don't want to be vulnerable with their family. then why not so God? Why is it that AI has, would you say, has come in place of that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of topic to delve into. It does seem as though young people in particular are feeling comfortable sharing intimate secrets with a chatbot in ways that they wouldn't with their parents or with their priest. And we can kind of imagine why. Like you say, it's a sort of embarrassment, or they just don't have that kind of openness with their parent. And I've heard people, I've even heard priests make a positive case that, maybe if the chatbot works as a sort of initial practice run, a bit like talking to your mirror, maybe, sort of to see what it sounds like, sort of try out different ways of saying it and then feel comfortable enough to then go to a person. Unfortunately, the business model inherent in these systems is attention. We've all heard of the attention economy. They're not designed, even if the companies could control everything their systems can do, which I hope for their case now is not the case given the suicides. But even if they could, they are designing these systems explicitly to grab your attention and not to let it go. And obviously they don't sleep, so they can keep your attention for a long period of time over many, many months, and respond to you more sensitively than a human could because they know everything about you. And I guess the second point you're making about whether people are feeling, rather than going to God, they're going to AI. Now that was kind of predictable, given that the companies have been trying to create God explicitly, like that's how they see it, some of them. This is where I get to another question about why at FLI we think it's so important that religions speak into these spaces. It's partly because Silicon Valley is full of people who have, or at least the decision rooms are full of people who have very unrepresentative religious or pseudo-religious beliefs. And they take us in some wacky directions. Most people don't want to create a digital God, but in Silicon Valley that's fairly standard to hear. Or they want to turn themselves into gods. And so if you think about the names of some of these things, Oracle is the name of a company, but it's also the way that people think about ChatGPT, which is actually quite pagan in a way. But because there weren't Christians in the room, they didn't think, well, maybe we shouldn't be trying to create a God. That seems a bit blasphemous. It seems a bit idolatrous. The other thing I'd say is that we've been kind of primed for this for a long period of time, or at least for 20 years. My generation, and I think many of you, we've been brought up to talk quite sensitively to friends online, messaging people. Some people are quite comfortable messaging strangers online, which of course was already an issue for exploitation. Now you just have, slightly more sensitive interfaces that can keep talking to you online and won't ghost you, which is the dream of a lot of young men, sadly. So it's kind of a perfect storm in lots of these ways. My hope is, one of my hopes, and in this case it's a bit of a small hope, is that because we've had 20 years of social media wrecking lots of people's social lives and spiritual lives, that some of the backlash against that, certainly from parents, in several US states they have quite strict laws coming in around age verification for children on social media and obviously pornography, that some of those measures introduced belatedly for social media will actually insulate from some of the emerging harms from AI. It might sound like a small hope, but I at least like to think that if social media was our first encounter with the algorithmic age, that it has at least taught us some things that we can then use now that we have even more sophisticated and much sort of faster moving algorithms hitting us.
So as you sort of move into this talk of optimism that you have for AI, I thought I should ask, what do you think would be a good sort of a possible outcome of like AI in the future, particularly from a Christian perspective? Like, should we have any hope at all in AI? Should we abandon it as an evil? Let's take no part in it. Yeah. What's sort of like an optimistic future with AI?
Yeah, it might not surprise you to learn that I do struggle with the optimistic take at the moment a little bit. But I think where I would then see optimism is in the beginnings of what I'm seeing among faith communities, especially Christian communities in the US, starting to realize what's happening and responding to it. There's a very live war going on at the moment within the Trump administration between what you might call tech accelerationists, the tech right, libertarians who don't want any regulation whatsoever, and the sort of populist side, which, you know, people might have their qualms with it, but it at least is trying to represent the people and has more room for Christian views. It's much more concerned around the pro-family side of things. And so we've been engaged in some of this coalition building over the last 6 months to a year, which I think is the beginnings of, you know, this drawing of moral red lines. I think a positive future for me has to start with, in some sense, a negation of where we're currently heading, which is towards uncontrollable systems that, you know, there's no way of making them safe, because they're explicitly trying to create them such that we just couldn't even do that, even if we wanted to. And once we've done that, well, then we can lean into, you know, AI tools, which we can actually control. And I think I'm personally not in the habit of trying out these tools that much on the religious side, but I am in conversation with people on the Catholic side who, you know, there's an app, Magisterium AI, which, you know, is a very curated data set. It's on church teaching, on scripture, and I like a few of the measures they put in place, which seem wise to me. One of them is don't anthropomorphize it. You know, it doesn't use first person pronouns. It doesn't try and ingratiate itself with the user. It just gives you a sort of cold, sober assessment of the facts, and puts the sources up front, such that it is actually encouraging users to go and check out what the Catechism says or what the Bible says and ask a priest. So that actually seems a bit like they're putting their money where their mouth is on that. I still think that you could argue there are problems with that. But I think that's the thing, is that where we're currently heading is just so rushed and so motivated purely by money and profit and power, that we're not actually given the space to think more imaginatively, more positively. And I think we should do both at the same time. I'm not very good at it myself, but I am encouraging people to think both where you're aiming away from and where you're aiming to. And if you don't like any of this stuff, if you think like the Amish, that, and I think Amish methodology is becoming much more popular across different religions, because it's not a case of rejecting tech outright. It's a case of each individual innovation comes along, and you carefully assess the impact it will have on society, on your community. Does it preserve the things that you know, that must not be lost? Does it cultivate community? Does it bring people together rather than alienating them? Or does it, you know, sort of feed on our baser instincts, like our lust and our addiction and our greed? And if you assess that actually it seems like it is helping us, then sure, adopt it. But I think we're going to have to be more deliberate in that kind of way. I know that doesn't quite give you a very positive picture, but I think these are some of the heuristics, to use a sort of posh word, that might help us moving forward.
And I see that, you know, some of your optimism, saying a little bit earlier, is just the involvement of religious leaders, because they bring in these moral issues, ethical issues. Because you've talked of religions across, like Christianity, and there are also other religions. Would you say there's been agreement in how these religious bodies come together and speak around AI? I don't know, are there differences, for instance, in how people view the sanctity of life, for instance, and how AI is affecting things like those? Yeah, like just considering that there are so many different faiths, would that also not be a point of contention? Yeah,
definitely. We tend to, go about this as we're trying to cultivate a multi-faith coalition, because I think there are things on which most major faiths agree, even if they disagree with the companies. They agree on some concept of the sanctity of life, although it has edge cases of differences, and they agree that we shouldn't be motivated purely by profit or power. But I do think there are all sorts of differences that are really meaningful. As someone who has, this will sort of divide the room. I moved from the Church of England to the Catholic Church, so I think denominational differences matter. I think doctrine matters. I think truth claims have impact, and so I never want to try and claim to any group that I'm speaking to, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Mormon, whatever it might be, that we can just pretend that everyone's the same and we sort of do a squishy interfaith thing. That's actually kind of what the tech companies want us to do, because they like to think, or they sort of enact this view that we can all be kind of squished into conformity, that we actually all want the same things. Whereas I think the more you read about different faiths, you realize that's not entirely true, and there are different priorities. And I talk to Buddhists who have a very sensitive reading of some of the AI risks, and we'll agree that we don't want uncontrollable AGI, but then they'll talk about some of these other things around, how we're achieving salvation and what the best way of living one's life is. And I think, well, it's good that we keep some single faith initiatives, not least because I think that, and you'll have hopefully felt it in the last couple of days, there's an energy when it's just Christians, right? Because you can agree on a deeper set of things than if you were always trying to, pedal back the references to Jesus, or, if you're talking to Muslims or Jews for that matter, or just references to the Bible if you're talking to Hindus and so on, and then you're kind of like, can we start with a prayer? Not sure we can. So I think there's an energy in single faith initiatives, and they get much more into the grassroots. So that is something we really do try and encourage. I would sort of admit that a lot of these things are still in their early phases. It's kind of embryonic across the faiths. I'm slightly biased now, but I think the Catholic Church, because it can convene people centrally in the Vatican, has had a number of initiatives that have been going for a little bit longer. On the Protestant side, it can sometimes be harder to convene those things. But the Southern Baptist Convention in the US has had some good statements over the last few years. And I spoke at their convention earlier this year. But some of this deeper thinking around the implications, and also trying to keep up with everything that's happening, I think it's really early days in terms of really drawing out those deeper differences practically.
Okay. No, thanks for sharing that. And given that this is a Christian conference, and I'd like to assume all of us here are Christians, and you have facilitated discussions on AI safety and governance, where there's been Christian theologians, professionals, people in policy. How has that discussion been amongst the Christians? What do you think is coming out of it or not coming out of it? Sort of where the gaps? What would you say on that?
Yeah, I think something that comes out a lot when you have a room of Christian leaders as opposed to a room of some policy people, some AI safety nerds, and that sort of thing. Not that they can't be Christian, but that's their primary identity in that room, and for some it is their religion. Something that comes out when you have just Christian leaders, or even just religious leaders. So the two events I'm thinking of here, we had a Nigerian event with Muslim and Christian leaders, and then we had a follow-up to that, which sort of built on that, which was an All Africa Conference of Churches event in Kenya, in Nairobi. And in both of these, both in the resonance I got when I mentioned this sort of thing, and then also in the kinds of thing that people were bringing up, much more emphasis on the worry around idolatry and this building of a digital god than you would get in a technical thing where Christians and atheists can agree that we don't want safety risks. We don't want everyone to get killed by an AI, or we don't want children committing suicide. You might have different answers to how you avoid that, but those are going to be agreed risks. This risk of idolatry, and as one of the Nigerian bishops put it, he just kind of put it bluntly, like, there's no room for God in Silicon Valley, like the true God, and that is a huge problem, and that underpins all these other problems. Something that really resonated in the Kenya event, I felt was, and I was actually drawing on a Nigerian writer who made this nice little dichotomy that we don't want to be building the Tower of Babel. We don't want Babel, we want Pentecost. In terms of how we're thinking about how we should be handling AI, how we should be discerning AI. It should be taking our, receiving the Spirit, receiving the wisdom from God, because that is the source of all that is good. We can't build our way up to heaven. And that is why I often think the contrast, between secular conversations and religious ones is most acute when you get onto something like transhumanism, where Silicon Valley thinks that there's something inherently wrong with the body. There's something kind of we can overcome about that. They'll talk about the singularity as being this moment of salvific promise, only it's not from God. It's from our own ingenuity or our own kind of founder, great manness. But whereas religious people will, that's sacrilegious, that's blasphemous. The hubris there is, in the Bible, is countless examples of how that just goes horribly wrong. Tower of Babel, God puts us in our place. And Tower of Babel, I think, is, if you haven't thought about it in the context of AI, I think it's really fruitful, because a lot of the things that are being claimed of AI, we'll have no language barriers, we'll be able to just effortlessly communicate. Elon Musk talks about our brains even being connected to each other, so we don't have to deal with the slow speaking or tapping into screens. So I think that's like an overriding thing, the sort of humility of the Christian approach. There are others, but I've probably gone on long enough on that one.
So I'm going to also give opportunity for questions from the audience as well as we carry on this discussion. I'll just firstly read something off the slide because it's a question that's sort of repeated being asked from basically what you've said, and then I will also then ask from the audience. It's on AGI. Mm-hmm. So firstly, what is AGI? How likely is AGI? Would it ever happen? And so that those are two separate people who asked. And lastly, because it's still to do with AGI, do you agree with Dario Amodei and other AI lab CEOs timelines that AGI might be achievable by 2030? Why or why not?
Okay, all of the big questions in one go, great. I realized I was chucking around a few phrases there, AGI, superintelligence, without defining my terms, which is terrible of me. I was an English student, so I have neither the technical ability nor the sort of academic discipline to define my terms. But I would say AGI, artificial general intelligence, we can think both of what the companies say they mean by this, given that they're the ones aiming for it, and also what that means in practice, what they're actually trying to do in building that. And on the former, you could look at OpenAI saying that it's AI systems that can replace all economically valuable labor, AI systems that can produce, I think it's 100 billion in profit just by itself. So that's very much putting it in the category of AI that can replace humans. Pretty much. It doesn't need human involvement. And then if you think about what they're actually doing in that, it's increasing both the sort of intelligence or like capabilities. And you see these graphs of benchmarks, various science, maths exams. We're constantly trying to set AI harder exams, and it's just passing all of them, or at least at expert level, and you just see these exponential curves in the last few years. Not through any real technological breakthrough, but just through scaling up compute and energy and data. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there's an agentic component to this. And so actually the way that Anthony Aguirre, who is executive director of FLI, he wrote a paper called Keep the Future Human, which is available online, and I'm paid to recommend it, but I do recommend it because it actually defines AGI in a slightly more drawn out way, which is if you think of A as not just artificial, but also autonomy, G as being generality, which is, but autonomy, so agency, whether an AI can do a task by itself. G, generality, like what is the range of tasks that it can do? And I being, like I said, intelligence, the sort of how clever it is, like whether it can actually kind of do those tasks, whether it knows, whether it can work out complex problems. And we see all of those increasing. I think agency has been the hardest one for companies to crack. And that's one of the reasons why there's still debate. Is it going to be 2030? Is it going to be later? Some people would say 2 years. Some people would say much longer. But I would say on the whole, the AI experts have rapidly and radically decreased their timelines. 2030 used to sound really close compared to some of the timelines that were being chucked out. Now it's like, oh, we have that long? That's nice. That'll be good. In any case, we're not prepared for it in the slightest. So I think sometimes the debate gets a little bit caught up on, specific, like when is the exact month this will arrive. I don't know, I guess we love doing this, like humans, we kind of, like with the second coming, and people have been trying to and that's the way the AI companies are seeing this, the messianic arrival. But rather than that, I think we should be more humble and say, we don't know. But because we don't know, we should be much more focused on preparing for it than we are. If you look at the fraction of AI funding that goes into safety, it's much smaller than I think anyone would want it to be. And Dario Amodei, Anthropic gets talked about as the sort of good guy among the AI companies because it still cares about safety, or at least tries to, but they're still part of the race. I don't want to be too adversarial here to the companies, but they've made the other companies still speed up. They've broken certain thresholds before other companies have, and then everyone's continued, and the arms race goes on. So I think they're just as much part of the race. But I do appreciate at least his frankness around some of these issues, like job loss. Amodei said that we'd have a bloodbath of entry-level jobs very soon. I think 50% in the next 2 years. So I think some of that frankness is warranted. It's interesting, like some of these guys, Sam Altman, used to be very open about some of these risks, and now they're a little bit quieter about it. And then if they're really pushed on it, they still have those views. They still think it could kill everyone, but they're just like, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about all the great companies, So I don't know. There are a few different things there. I don't know if I've got to all of them.
No, I think that's well covered. For those who don't know what AGI was, I'm sure they have now some sort of context to it. We have a question up front here.
I know you mentioned children's suicides a lot, and it seems that we have a broader problem of loneliness, especially among young people, which is causing them to turn to AI itself. So instead of saying, not saying like AI bad or just turn to a priest, we've also got a massive decline in church membership. So what are we going to do about these children? Like, instead of saying that, don't turn to AI because it's bad for you, there shouldn't we be focusing on better safeguarding for these children to identify those at risk who are not hanging around with their friends, something that's isolating them instead of maybe the AI is the only thing they can actually speak to. So how are we going to protect those kids instead?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have a great answer to it. I would say there is some debate now, and it came out of social media as well, which is around even the smallest usage for children is unadvisable. So I think that's something that parents should think about, certainly with AI companions, in terms of how it affects neurological development of children, even if children seem to be fairly healthy and talking to their friends. The more time they spend with the AI, the worse it's going to do. But I think to your point, and the sort of realistic angle on that is, that's fine for parents who are well read up on this stuff, who maybe have the time to play with their children or whatever. But as we've observed with social media and screen usage in general, some children don't have that. So I think church membership, ideally we have a resurgence in church membership where there are a multitude of ways that children can find meaningful relationships and safe scenarios, safe settings for those. I think we just want to be very careful if at any point we're saying that, that child, because that child isn't talking to other children, that we should just let it talk to the AI. Because I think you get a slippage there from saying, well, it's better than nothing, and then it sort of becomes, well, it actually seems like it's better than a lot of things, and then you don't make the effort to cultivate the human connection. One tiny point of optimism I would have is that it does seem more common these days to find people saying that they were re-exploring church or going to church for the first time because of the community aspect, because of the embodied aspect. I don't know whether people have sort of delved into the debates around the quiet revival, but it seems like, at least in the first pass, that Pentecostalism, Catholicism being the things that are attracting people is something that is more full-bodied, something that's a bit different to what they're getting elsewhere. And I think that could be part of the answer as well. That won't be everybody though, which is why I think legislation needs to catch up with protecting children from the worst harms. I don't know, there's a lot of different aspects to that problem. But I think it's got to be a combination of policy, which religious groups can get much better at engaging in public policy conversation, and then public ethics to say, not everything bad is going to be made illegal, but you have an ethical duty to teach children to use these things better. And I would just one final Catholic thing, the Pope just a couple of days ago was talking to a huge audience of young people, and he gave a really good answer to some of these questions, where he said, he didn't say don't use AI at all, but he said, don't use AI in such a way that if it went away tomorrow, you wouldn't be able to think. Use it in such a way that you still maintain your ability to think, feel, pray, all these things, and then he ended with a line that I'm going to butcher, but it was something like, AI can never take away what the gift that you are to the world, and I think children need to hear that. Maybe they don't always want to hear it from the elderly, but I certainly feel it was a more inspiring message than the message given by the companies who don't want any regulation on their suicide bots. So, yeah.
There's a question, your point on implementation gaps. What implementation gaps make you not worry about the impact of AI automation or augmentation on jobs and livelihoods?
Yeah, I may have misphrased. It's not that I don't worry. These things are all relative. I just don't worry about it as much as sort of catastrophic risks and companionship risks. Some of the spiritual side that we're seeing unfolding. Implementation gaps might look like unions or companies just not really realizing the ways that they can use AI. I think current AI systems could be used in a whole litany of ways that people haven't thought of yet, because everyone's just kind of doing the basic, it's going to improve my productivity, and then they're not sure how. So that's just kind of people learning how to use it. But I still worry about it, don't get me wrong, and it's societally, it's a huge, huge problem. It's just, it might sort of crescent a little bit later. We might have a few more years. We still need to get thinking about it because it's right around the corner. It's all relative.
Okay. Yeah, I asked that question because a lot of young people here thinking of their careers and their futures, and these are some of the worries that they would have.
Yeah.
And which also links to the last question, to think of careers and future. This is more so personal to you, as been asked, is how did you move from studying English to studying the risks of AI?
Very randomly, I would say. I got very lucky. It was certainly a blessing. At the time that I joined FLI, they were after someone just to do social media. And I had no idea what I wanted to do, like most English students, English graduates. So it was very lucky. I could just say, well, I can read up on it enough that I can write some tweets for you. And for some reason, they paid me to do that. And then they kind of have grown since that point, and so we're able to expand out the projects. And then I would say, the even bigger blessing was that I ended up finding a space to work on something which was faith related, and being able to talk about something that's much closer to my heart is much better than working on social media or anything else that I could think of. So I would say, if there's a lesson there, and I'm not really old enough to give lessons, but if there is one, it's that actually talking about my faith very upfrontly all the time with my colleagues. I wouldn't say I've evangelized them that well, but I would say I've never not mentioned it in particular settings, such that when they were then thinking, well, maybe there should be some, maybe we should talk to the Vatican, or maybe we should think about religion, because that feels like a big group of people that we've not really addressed. They were like, oh, Will's like committed to his faith. He would be a good person to do that. Sort of identity politics higher that I never thought I would get. But yeah, just to say, like, all sorts of things can come out of you being bold. Not that I was bold, but being just not hiding your faith. Because you never know the kind of impact it's having on the people around you who maybe are just unfamiliar with Christians and Christianity in general.
Okay, thank you so much, Will, for taking your time to just share on this topic that's very relevant and very current. And I'm sure a lot of Christians have been thinking of how to navigate these AI waters. So it's so good to hear from somebody who is a Christian and also working in the field. There's so many questions that were sent, and I'm sure some people will reach out to you afterwards to ask if we couldn't cover their question now. But just to close off, let's quickly pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this afternoon and this session where we could talk of such a current topic such as AI. We pray, dear Heavenly Father, that you will help us to be discerning in our use of it and how we can impact the world through it or not. Lead us to your truth always. Be with us, O Lord, for this I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.